Thank you, Andres, and thank you everybody at the Monterey Public Library, Brian Edwards, the new director, and the committee that put this together. Cannery Road Days, it was spearheaded by Tim Thomas, whose idea it was, and then Andres and me and Greg Kaye and Rebecca Mostow, who is the education director of the Western Flyer Association. So it's fun to work together and bringing together various entities in the community. So, and I think our sponsors, the Cannery Row Company, has helped a lot in helping to mount this program and publicize it. So it's genuinely a community effort. So it's appropriate that I mention that before I talk about the we in Sea of Cortez and what that means. So I want to talk about collaboration and partnerships today. And kind of behind the scenes of the Sea of Cortez and the kind of book that it is, and how the idea was kind of born and flowered, and then what the narrative we suggests about the book. So those are the three parts of my talk. And I'd be happy to answer any questions at the end. So just type questions in the chat and we can discuss them. So first of all, I want to start with the book itself. And there are really two books, which is confusing to a lot of people because there's a 1941 Sea of Cortez, a leisurely journal of travel and research, and a 1951 log from the Sea of Cortez, which is really the lopped off narrative of Sea of Cortez. Notice only with John Steinbeck's name on it and with a new essay about Ed Ricketts. I want to point out that neither of these are extraordinary covers. Steinbeck really didn't like the covers to these books. He didn't think his editor was cared enough about this whole venture that he took with Ricketts in 1940, when he and Ed Ricketts sailed to the Sea of Cortez to study invertebrates. Notice how small the type is on the cover. So it's really hard to read. So it's not amazing cover. Steinbeck said it was a foul cover. But it does really focus the names, of course, of the two men involved. John Steinbeck, novelist, Ed Ricketts, marine biologist, are very large on the first edition cover. And they're identified. Steinbeck, the novelist, and Ricketts, the biologist, joined forces in a unique fishing trip. Now, I've kind of talked about this on other occasions during this outreach, but, this is a nonfiction text, obviously, and it's scientific and literary. And the editors and the people at Penguin, Viking at that time, didn't really know what to do with it or what to call it. So it's a leisurely journal, it's a fishing trip, which it's definitely not. So they kind of wrestled with, how do we market this? What do we call it? It was easy to mark The Grapes of Wrath. That was a novel. It was a moment of very much, the end of the Depression. It was published at a very appropriate cultural moment, but this book was problematic. And as I said, Steinbeck hated it. The jacket is a foul thing. But the back cover of the first edition calls it a collaboration of two friends, one a novelist, one a marine biologist, has produced a volume which is fascinating popular science as woven into a narrative of man's dreams, his ideals, and his accomplishments through the centuries. Well, that's a little vapid in terms of describing exactly what the book is about. Sea of Cortez is one of those rare books that are all things to all readers. Again, it doesn't actually say very much. The record of a brief collecting exhibition into the lonely Gulf of California. It will be science to the scientist, philosopher to the philosopher, and to the average man an adventure in living and thinking. No mention of crew or obviously Steinbeck's wife, who was along on the cruise, just really focuses on the two central characters, or the two men whose names are on the cover of the book. Now, it was reissued in 1951 as the log from the Sea of Cortez. It is actually not really a log. Again, Covici, Steinbeck's editor, and the people at Viking didn't really know what to call it, the narrative portion. If they'd called it the narrative from the Sea of Cortez, that sounds a little clumsy. So they called it a log, which is, ships do have a ship's log, but it's very kind of cut and dried information about weather, tides, wind, etc. So this is a very expansive narrative, so it's not really a log. They later, in that green banner, say it's the narrative portion of the Sea of Cortez, but it's not really a log. And I love these two pictures that were on the inside cover because it really does highlight, again, Steinbeck and Ricketts. I don't think that any two pictures juxtaposed in their whole careers made them look so much alike. So they look like they're truly collaborators, bearded men. As a recent article says, a legendary writer, a quirky scientist, and an epic voyage would rewrite the rules of ecology, which in many ways this voyage did. And they do look quirky there. We're certainly it's not a traditional look that they have in that pictures. And the back cover of the 1951 edition really emphasized, again, Steinbeck as a writer, because this time only Steinbeck's name is on the cover of the book. And this, I think, is one of the best comments possible about this book, Sea of Cortez. When Louis Gannett, who reviewed books for the New York Herald Tribune, wrote, "There is more of the whole man, John Steinbeck, in Sea of Cortez than in any of his novels. This is at once a record of a serious biological expedition and of the impact of a biologist and novelist upon each other's minds. A kind of human sociology." That's really interesting, a kind of human sociology. Again, that intersection between writer and scientist. The collaborative nature of this text was highlighted in this comment. The best of Steinbeck is in it, the mellowest and the crotchetiest, and the funniest, I might add. So 2 editions of this book. If you pick up the book today, you will more than likely pick up the log from the Sea of Cortez, the 1951 edition, which includes an essay about Ed Ricketts. Now, Ricketts' name was taken off the 1951 edition, but Steinbeck added an essay about his best friend, which he wanted to be the foreword to the book, so that you read about Ed Ricketts before you read the text of Sea of Cortez. Unfortunately, an editorial decision from the 1990s shifted it to the back of the book, where it should not be. Because really, to know Ricketts initially is to understand the book better. Essay should be in the front. Now, you also have to think, why did Steinbeck lop off the name of his friend on this 1951 edition? Because he did write the narrative. And Ricketts was responsible for the phyletic catalog, which was part of the 1941 edition. So I think Steinbeck thought, well, this part was mine. So he didn't put Ricketts' name on it. But you could also argue that writing the essay about Ed Ricketts probably did more for Ricketts' reputation as a biologist and as a scientist and as a thinker than perhaps having the phyletic catalog reissued. Anyway, all these covers, these subsequent covers for the log from the Sea of Cortez, really do highlight it as a male narrative. They again call it a 6-week fishing trip on this pan paperback cover. This is one of my favorite covers, Tiny and the Ray, which is one of the adventures at the end, but it looks like a boy's adventure book when you publicize it like that. So that was a 1960 cover for a reissued text. And here, finally, the woman appears in a 1964 Pan book edition and a 1974 reprint. I'm not sure what in the world this refers to. In the Sea of Cortez, it does suggest something about Sweet Thursday, which is mentioned on the cover of the book. So there is a central female character in Sweet Thursday. So maybe it's kind of Sweet Thursday transposed upon the log from the Sea of Cortez. But at least That's definitely not Carol in that picture. So I can say that, but it does bring the female presence in. So the book is a collaboration from the beginning. Steinbeck said he hated collaborations, but Sea of Cortez was definitely a collaboration between two men who had been best friends from 1930 to 1948. And so this is really a tribute to what their relationship meant and the conversations they had throughout the 1930s. That's really what Sea of Cortez is, a book of conversations and a book of investigation. Now, I want to talk about, though, this whole sense of collaboration in the context of their partnerships as well. Because the whole subject of the talk, the name of my talk was The We in Sea of Cortez. And the question I'm often asked is, why was Carol left out of the narrative of Sea of Cortez? She was on the trip, and why was the woman left out? So I kind of want to talk about collaborative partnerships in terms of the male-female partners that both Ricketts, Steinbeck, and in the context of Robinson Jeffers, who they were all reading at the time as well, because the women played very key roles in the kind of intellectual life of the men in their lives. So briefly, I'm going to talk about Tony Jackson, who met Ed after the trip and moved into the lab in 1941. Eunice Robinson Jeffers, who were not close friends of Steinbeck and Ricketts, but they both read his poetry avidly. And John and Carol Steinbeck, of course, who was the central relationship that was on board the Western Flyer. So first, Toni Volconi, she's a very interesting woman. She was born in Berkeley, and I love her name, Susan B. Anthony Solomons. Her mother, she had a rough childhood. Her mother was institutionalized. Her father was kind of a pioneer. He helped create the John Muir Trail. She was initially raised in Yosemite, and then they moved to Berkeley. And Toni attended UCLA, but left before graduating. Now, that's just a shorthand description of her life. Well, a couple of really important things. She was a termite. Lewis Terman, who was a professor at Stanford, began a kind of very controversial study in 1921, looked for students who stored over 135 on the Stanford Binet intelligence test, and those were called termites. And he studied sort of, their intellectual growth and development. It was seen as, later as, somewhat elitist and problematic, but several of the people who were in the Ricketts lab group were termites. And it was certainly a source of pride. So she was one very intelligent woman. She came to Monterey in 1940 from San Francisco with a woman named Virginia Scardili, who was a teacher and a good friend of hers. And she came to Cannery Row, and she apparently asked to use the bathroom at the lab. Now, that's probably a bit exaggerated. Virginia knew Ed well, and they probably went to the lab, and she introduced Toni to Ed. And Ed started playing her Baroque music, and she'd never appreciated music in the way that Ed made her appreciate music. And she said tears were streaming down her face as she listened to Ed's Baroque music. So she moved in with him shortly thereafter. And she was the one, and the reason that she comes into this story, I think it is an important part of it, not only that she was an intelligent and creative woman and was really kind of a partner for Ed throughout the 1940s, but she worked closely with Ed on his scientific work and actually with John as well. She typed the manuscript of Sea of Cortez from John's yellow legal pads, sitting at Ed's little desk. She typed the whole thing. And Ricketts acknowledges her in Sea of Cortez. If you ever pick up the 1941 Sea of Cortez, you should read Ricketts' introduction to the phyletic catalog, because he basically said, hey, this was a lot of work. And it cost a lot of money for me to get reprints I needed. And I went, you can't only just collect, you have to do the scientific background work to find out if the anyone has studied the species before and what papers have been published on these animals. So Ricketts did a lot of work to assemble that catalog. And so he does say, in part, acknowledgments are due also to the following, most of all to Tony Jackson, who, in addition to manuscript revising and glossary constructing, transcribed the bulk of the difficult text, both journal and appendix, the latter phase involving that most vexing of all secretarial tasks, the editing of scientific copy interlarded with handwriting of doubtful legibility, i.e. his own. So, she did a lot of work in the process of producing this manuscript. She has some funny stories about it. She said they inserted little jokes into the manuscripts, and they put them in there just to catch the proofreader and see if the proofreader was really paying attention. They called one animal that they found Proctophilius wincelli, and she said it's the name of a new species of something or other that lives in the anus of a sea cucumber. And the wincelli is, of course, Walter, whom John and Het abominated. So you call Walter Winchell, you give a new species a name. I don't know if it probably didn't go through the whole scientific nomenclature process, but something that lives in the anus of a sea cucumber. We really expected to be sued over the wincelli bit, but nobody picked it up, or if they did, they were of like mind, which is about Walter Winchell. But, Tony, was a key figure in Ed's life, and she got more and more confident, actually, as she lived with Ed and lived in the lab. And they were going to write a high school textbook on tide pools together in 1945 to stress cooperation, which in tide pool animals is perhaps as important as competition, the struggle for existence, about which we've been hearing nothing else since Darwin was popularly misinterpreted. Darwin, I think, is quite pure, very little teleology. So that sense that, again, emphasizing cooperation, I think, is important, both in the sort of collaborative nature of this text and in the importance of these kind of partnerships, these marriages I'm describing as also key to the text, Sea of Cortez. She was also politically engaged. There's a whole film recently about her political engagement, about bringing Japanese back to Monterey, but she became involved politically right after the war because she was working at Fort Ord, and many Blacks came back to Monterey because they were treated better than in other parts of the country. And apparently a woman that she knew in a local hat shop was refused help, and that infuriated Tony. So she helped set up an interracial committee, and one of her first talks was in Salinas. Amazingly, the PTA, especially when you consider what education is like today, but the PTA set up a course for the fall about the home and how children can have respect for all races and appreciation of the part they played in building America, ways in which the home can cooperate with other groups, such as the schools, in education for understanding. Astounding that was an outreach program by the PTA in 1945. And Tony Ricketts gave the first in a series of lectures, and hers was The Home and Racial Tolerance. So she was very political, more so than Ed was at the time, and she sort of politicized Ed, certainly with her own engagement. Now, I really include Jeffers and Una Jeffers because I love this quote, but they too were a partnership, and they collaborated. And I love what Jeffers says about his wife, this intense relationship that he had with her. He said, "She never saw any of my poems until they were finished in types, yet by her presence and conversation, she co-authored every one of them. Sometimes I think there must be some value in them, if only for that reason. She's more like a woman in a Scotch ballad, passionate, untamed, and rather heroic, or like a falcon than any ordinary person. And that's a superb tribute to Una and her role in his life. But it does speak to the role that Tony had in Ed's life, that Una had in Jeffers' life, and that Carol had in Steinbeck's life. So the third partnership here that I want to emphasize in terms of collaboration and working together and the female role in this trip eventually is Carol's role in John's writing and output. They were married in 1930 in Los Angeles. They soon moved to Pacific Grove, where Steinbeck, of course, had a summer cottage on 11th Street, a family cottage that his father had built in 1903. So they moved in there because it was cheap, and he was working to be published, of course, to make money as a writer. And so his apprenticeship years were spent in Pacific Grove. From 1936 to 40, they lived in Los Gatos, where he wrote The Grapes of Wrath and most of Mice and Men. And they were divorced in 1943 after the Sea of Cortez trip. But they were still very much married in 1940 and very much together, which I'll talk about in a minute, when they went on the Sea of Cortez trip. I wrote a book about Carol, so I'll put up the cover here. I think it's a splendid cover. I love the cover. But it was a companionable marriage. It was really a collaborative marriage, and she was absolutely key to his life. He would not have written the books he did without her input. She was editor, she was typist, she came up with titles, she came up with ideas. She was more political than he. She trimmed his sentences so he wasn't as effusive and romantic as he was when she first met him. So she really helped make him the writer that he was. There's the original picture, probably taken in 1935 when they went to Mexico for the first time. It might be a picture that looks like a passport picture, but it might have been a picture they needed for some kind of permit to drive to Mexico, as they did across the Pan American Highway together in 1935. And I think it speaks, going to Mexico in 1935 or Baja in 1940 was a bit of an adventure just in and of itself, because the highway, for instance, in 1935 had just been completed, so it was rather dangerous. And, going to Baja in 1940 was a, unpopulated place that few people visited, most of it roadless area. So there's the kind of pluckiness about both of them that I think characterized their marriage. Here's some of the things he said about her in the mid-30s. I wish I knew Carol wasn't hating it too, the struggle to become a published writer who made money. He was published at this point, but wasn't making any money. If I were able to do as much for her as she is doing for me, I would be very happy. I work hard enough, but nothing happens. Carol works, something happens. I love Carol, but she's far more real to me than I am to myself. If I think of myself, I often find it's Carol I'm thinking of. If I think what I want, I often have to ask her what it is. If one should want to think of me as a person, I'm under the belief that he would have to think of Carol. Now, that's true sublimation of your, personality in another person. But I think to some extent she was outgoing, lively, a little bit crude, caustic, witty. And I think sometimes he let her sort of take the lead role, certainly in any kind of social interactions. And so he would kind of, I don't mean hide in a negative sense, but he would step back so that he could observe the scene, and she was front and center. Carol, said a friend, seemed to have this great understanding of the relationship at that time between farmer, shipper, grower, people and bands and pro-America and all that group on one side, as opposed to the farm worker on the other side. Carol seemed to have a terrific understanding of social relationships. So she really did, and she was the one perhaps who dragged John to meetings of the Communist John Reed Club in Carmel. She was the one who urged him to become more politically and socially engaged. So rather like Tony, she was an activist in a lot of ways, and I think really sparked John as much as Ed did in other ways, sparked his awareness and his social engagement. So that The Grapes of Wrath, published in April 1939, his signature work, was dedicated to Carol, who willed this book, because Carol had been behind it every inch of the way. She had told him throughout the writing, stay with the detail, stay with the detail. She read it and typed it as he wrote it, and so it was definitely a collaborative venture, published in 1939. Now, finally, I want to turn to the We of Sea of Cortez. What happened after the publication of The Grapes of Wrath is that I think both John and Carol more or less collapsed. John did physically. He had exhausted himself writing The Grapes of Wrath. He had sciatica. He was in bed with pain. Publicity just overwhelmed both of them. Carol had to answer letters. She went a bit crazy. So it was a very tense time in their marriage and in their partnership. And it's certainly true that things were, rocky in 1939. But yet, in the Christmas of 1939, they decided to go together with Ricketts up to San Francisco Bay and beyond into Marin to catalog marine life. And they were planning to do a high school textbook, all three of them together. So the We of Sea of Cortez started shortly after The Grapes of Wrath as a kind of collaborative venture that Carol was a part of from the very beginning. She went on this Christmas trip in 1939 up the coast. And Steinbeck himself, declared that he was going to shift directions and that he needed to do something different from what he had been doing for the last, 4 years of the 1930s, when he produced what we call the Labor Trilogy, In Dubious Battle, Of Mice and Men, and The Grapes of Wrath. And so he says the new work must jump to include other species besides the human. That is why my interest in biology and ecology becomes so sharpened. The bioecological pattern, having at its conception base an immeasurable lengthened time sequence, does not admit the emphasis of such crises as human unemployment, except insofar as they vitally threaten the existence of the species. So what he's doing is kind of shrinking the immediate situation and saying, okay, labor in California and strikes and the Depression shrinks if you think about this, bioecological pattern, which is, far longer in time, in sequence. And so, any individual human problem shrinks. So that was his mindset as he set out to write The Sea of Cortez. Now, here's their first trip to Mexico, a jolly sort of jaunt that the friends labeled adventure. And they made this cartoon for them as they start out driving to Mexico, John and Carol together. But I think what they also were interested in, both of them were interested in wanting to go to Mexico. Steinbeck had wanted to go to Mexico throughout the 1930s. And Carol was very much a part of that. And I love to show this painting by Frida Kahlo in the context of thinking about why Steinbeck was so drawn to Mexico, because this is another sort of interesting collaborative relationship between Diego Rivera and Frida Kahlo. He took her with him when he went to Detroit to paint a mural, and she was not happy up there. And so she painted this picture which juxtaposes America, particularly Detroit, and the factories and the, abrupt lines and the noise, those megaphones blasting out sound, the wires, the electrical wires, the smoke, and the vertical lines against the rootedness of Mexico, the natural life of Mexico, the ancient civilizations, the sun and the moon, in the sky, the sense of nature's emphasis over mechanization. So really, she's putting the two side by side just to look at different values and to juxtapose those values. So I think anybody reading Sea of Cortez has to consider Steinbeck's comments about the native people. I'm not going to talk about that today, but I think he's really trying to do something similar to what Frida Kahlo does in this painting, is simply to note the differences between cultures. One, a primary culture, if you will, Mexico, and the other, an industrial powerhouse, and look at the difference in values. So Carol was very curious about this too. She kept a diary in the first 1935 trip, and it was a very kind of vivid diary of their trips. And John said, she's the writer in the family, actually, and she recorded some of this. So was Carol a part of the we of Sea of Cortez? She certainly was very much engaged in the trip. Carol threw herself into any endeavor, whether it was the writing of The Grapes of Wrath or editing John's work or coming up with titles, etc. And she later said, what a time we had. That was the happiest time of my entire life, which seems, I'm certainly an extravagant comment, but I think she really meant it. I think it was this sense that she was one of the crew and the 7 people on board the ship. She was very, very much a part of that venture. Sparky, in his little book called With Steinbeck on the Sea of Cortez, said that Carol was supposed to be the cook. But that's a bit dismissive. I mean, I don't know if she signed on for cook. I suspect not, because her husband was paying for the trip. Certainly she was in a somewhat privileged position as the wife of the man who had chartered the boat. I don't know if anybody would choose to be in the galley all day, because it's cramped and hot, and it's much more fun to be on the deck talking about ideas with your husband and his best friend. So Steinbeck writes that we carried no cook and dishwasher. It had been understood that we would all help. And I think that Carol certainly wouldn't have accepted the role. She was a feisty woman, and I don't think she would have ever signed on for the role of being cook for the whole way. At any rate, she didn't cook, and Sparky did, and he kind of groused about it. There is, some kind of slight evidence of what she did on the trip. Ricketts himself kept a journal, and he mentions Carol at times and what she was doing. There was a San Diego reporter who talked to her in San Diego about John's views on Russia and Russian aggression. And she loyally quoted John in that interview, who had said, "I am for racial minorities whenever they appear to be in danger," which is an interesting comment. So he kind of shifts from just a focus on Southwest migrants and Okies to a world order that's shifting dramatically. And he kind of, states his political preference there. Or she states it for him. But I think that my initial title, The We in Sea of Cortez, is the narrative voice, not only the physical presence of Carol, which I argue is really significant, but also the narrative voice that John opts for in this book. he starts out in the introduction saying, we made a trip into the Gulf. Sometimes we dignified it by calling it an expedition. One of the reasons we gave ourselves for this trip, and when we used this reason, we called the trip an expedition, was to observe the distribution of invertebrates, to see and record their kinds and numbers, how they lived together, what they ate, and how they reproduced. That plan was simple, straightforward, and only part of the truth. But we did tell the truth to ourselves. We were curious. We wanted to see everything our eyes would accommodate. Look at the number of the emphasis on we. Okay, they're looking at animal communities, but they're also a community themselves. And I think he creates a community voice for this text, which is so much about animal communities. And the community voice is a kind of generative we that includes Carol. It's because Steinbeck doesn't mention himself in the book, and he doesn't mention Ricketts in the book. They aren't mentioned by name. And he, as novelist, makes characters, almost fictional characters, out of everybody else on the crew. Tex and Tiny and Sparky and Tony, the righteous man who doesn't like, the coast pilot because, who embraces the coast pilot because he doesn't like anything to be sort of vague or uncertain. So he's very good at creating characters. The sea cow, the motor of the skiff is also a character. So I think that his novelistic strength comes through in the characters that he creates of the crew and the engine. But he, Ricketts, and Carol, and to some extent the crew as well, are all a part of the we of the expedition, what they want to accomplish together. So here is Carol on the boat, and this would be a native inhabitant that came to sit and tell stories on the boat. But I would imagine that's probably where she sat most of the time, on the deck, on the rail, listening, smiling, talking. That really captures, I think, her spirit. She's very much present. And then I love this picture. The handsome sea cow was not only a living thing, but a mean, irritable, contemptible, vengeful, mischievous, hateful living thing. Steinbeck's very funny what he has to say about the sea cow. But look at how they're together. Carol and John are wearing similar striped shirts, rather like the Hemingways who dressed alike. Carol and John kind of tended to dress a bit alike in pants and similar shirts throughout the 1930s. But they were partners, and Ricketts is there too. They're all going collecting together. I did talk to Tony Berry in one interview when he was in his 90s, and he was not going to gossip about the cruise. I wanted to hear more of the gossip, of course, but he said Carol was a great collector, and she went along on every collecting expedition. And he said she was plucky and she was there and very, very much present. Now later, Steinbeck wrote this later as an introduction to Ricketts' seminal 1939 text, Between Pacific Tides, a book about intertidal communities in Monterey Bay. Of course, part of the reason for this trip to see Cortez was to do something similar, look at communities in Baja. So Steinbeck was involved in Ricketts' Ricketts' thinking and his publication, but he wrote a preface for Ricketts' Between Pacific Tides, and he said, a revised edition, he said, the word participation is used advisedly. Now that word participation is one of the most important words that Ricketts and Steinbeck used. Participation means full engagement, really seeing, looking, paying attention. Steinbeck wanted to, engage readers. So he uses it a lot when he talks about his ideal reader is to participate in the text on various levels. And the reader will, participate more fully depending on his or her engagement, and readers will get out of a text what they put into it, he said on several occasions. But he describes his sort of ideal audience here, both in someone looking in the inner title and at books. Children and those adults whose minds and eyes are not clouded by fear or dullness, nor shut or ingrown by worry, seem to have a positive hunger for associations and participation with all observable life. And since observation is the entering bridge to association, we find children and naive adults observing the quick and meaningful light of an anthill or beehive, and so associating with it, that ant or bee emerges with human attributes. So this is Carol too. So she was a participant. Naive adults doesn't mean adults who are, not, completely aware of the complexities of life, but those who can be like children and see like children do. So again, this narrative we that is so powerful throughout the text, and that sense of participation, you see it everywhere in Sea of Cortez. So I'm just talking about the beginning of the book, but throughout that, it's such a powerful presence of the we as the narrative voice. We sat on a crate of oranges and thought what good men most biologists are. So that's as close as you get as kind of identifying Ricketts and his presence in the book, because Ricketts was exactly this kind of scientist. He wasn't a dry ball who had a crusted mind. He was temperamental, moody, lecherous, loud, laughing, and healthy. So the dry balls are the other kind of scientists, and that's not Ricketts. And he writes about, Carol's participation on the trip. Carol is beginning to be homesick for her garden, he said at the end of the trip, but she'd been marvelous on this trip. I don't know any other woman who could have done it. And Tony Berry said she was good on the trip, 75% well-behaved. He was appalled. She jumped in the water once with a gold watch on, and that he didn't appreciate that. He thought that was terrible behavior. And so that's why it's 75% well-behaved. And Carol did outrageous things. She could take her clothes off in front of everybody and shock everybody. She loved to shock people. So she sometimes did kind of outrageous things. Maybe it was attention getting, or maybe it was just trying to cross boundaries of behavior. And she was just extravagant in her actions. I did interview Tony. At that point, she was Tony Balconi, but Tony Jackson, Ricketts' partner. My speculation about why he didn't mention her in Sea of Cortez is that they were using a sardine boat and a sardine boat crew, and those fellows wouldn't ordinarily dream. Well, of course, they might dream of having a woman aboard. Bad luck, etc. They were mostly Sicilians, I think. This was a very male sort of thing, science and the sea, as far as the doing and as far as the writing. I can imagine that bringing her into the picture would complicate things from a writing standpoint. It would have. Even to bring John and Ned into it would have complicated it from a writing standpoint. So I think this is a creative decision on John's part. Because John loved this book. He thought it was the best of all of his books. It was his favorite among all of his books. And he said of it, perhaps it's a little crazy, but it's a good clearing out of a lot of ideas that I've been working on, that have been working on me for a long time. And they do fit into the loose framework and design of such a book. Pat's getting a darn fine book. Pat Kilvici was his editor. And one that he probably can't sell at all. It'll be fun to read, but not by the take a book to bed public. The more I consider it, the less the very wide appeal it seems to me it will have. The general public is not given to playful speculation. The rage and contempt for the critics will be amusing and like old times. It'll be kind of good too, because the work is pretty good. I know it is. It certainly is the most difficult work I've ever undertaken. I mean, that's really a tribute to the importance of this book. And he's looking backwards to the 30s and a lot of ideas that he worked out in the 30s. And of course, that includes Carol, because she was there every step of the way. This is the only portrait of John writing. It's done by Judith Diem. And her husband did another portrait. And her husband captured a kind of angry John, who was, by the time he came to write the book, was separated from Carol. Here he looks just sad, I think, in Judith's portrait, maybe focused, but also sad. And Elwood's portrait captured something else about John. Distorted, nasty, or I guess agonized, sort of an abstraction, but so very fine, he wrote about the portrait. But certainly Steinbeck was sad by the time he came to write Sea of Cortez, because his marriage was coming to an end by that point. He had met another woman. He met her before he went on the Sea of Cortez trip, but they didn't fully develop their relationship until afterwards. And eventually he divorced Carol in 1943 and married Gwen. So the writing of the book was a troubling time in his life. And I think that may be important in the book. I think the book is both powerful and I think a great deal depth of feeling expressed in the book about both the possibilities and the pain of human experience. And I think that Carol's presence is in the book as well as in the voyage itself. So that is the end of my talk. So I will stop sharing there. And if you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer them. Is there anything in the text? I'd love to answer questions. I love questions. So questions are more fun than talking. So did the 1941 version also use we extensively? There's one, they're exactly the same. The 1941 and the 1951 texts are the same. So people think it's a different book. It is the same narrative portion. The narrative part of it is exactly the same, whether it's the 1941 Sea of Cortez or the 1951 log from the Sea of Cortez. It's just, think of it as Steinbeck took a saw to it and sawed the book in half, and the phyletic catalog was lopped off. So the 1951 text is just the narrative portion of the book. So, will the Western Flyer come back to Monterey permanently? Yes. Well, it is coming to Monterey, back to Monterey. It'll be here this summer. It's been restored in Port Townsend and in Seattle. It's a beautiful boat now. Sorry I didn't include a picture of it, but it's going to be an educational vessel modeled on Steinbeck and Ricketts' relationship and their the way that they integrated science and humanities. And it will be most of the time in Monterey, at least 9 months a year, and then it will travel to other it'll be an educational vessel traveling to other locations, occasionally to Sea of Cortez and occasionally up to Alaska. So, yes, it's coming, it's coming, it's coming. I should have a banner to say, how they used to in the when I was growing up, they used to have new cars that it was really exciting that when a new car model was going to appear and they'd cover it up with a blanket and you'd get to see just the shape of the car. And then, soon it's coming. We should do that with the Sea of Cortez. We should have a big boat out in the bay and have it covered, and then we can unveil it at a particular time. Let's see. Yes. The good folks of the bookshop Santa Cruz paid tribute to Steinbeck in their spring newsletter, saying he's an author who can center place, human relationships, and history in every sentence. What a lovely, that's a lovely idea. Thank you, Bookshop Santa Cruz. What did Carol do after the divorce? Well, she got a lot of money from Steinbeck. He gave her the manuscripts to the Grapes of Wrath. He gave her the proceeds for the Grapes of Wrath. So a lot of money. And she bought houses in Carmel, which was a smart investment. She made a very bad marriage. When I interviewed people about her second marriage, not one person had a good word to say about the guy. And then she married a third time and was very happy. So she lived in Carmel Valley and was happy. However, I think that Steinbeck was kind of the love of her life. So, I mean, that relationship really defined her. Let's see. How do you think Carol would have changed the book if she'd been editing it? I don't know. She was I think by the time Steinbeck is writing this book, his style is gelled, if you will. I mean, the style is pretty spare. It's funny. It's sculpted. It's not, if she edited East of Eden, she might have had a heavier hand. But I think she, would have typed it, but he'd found his voice. So I think his voice is there pretty strongly. So that would be my thing. Answer to that. The curious, what intrigued you to study the Steinbecks in the first place? Well, I was working at San Jose State as an instructor, and they wanted somebody to direct the Steinbeck Center. And I was perhaps the least qualified person imaginable because I had gone to graduate school in North Carolina. I hadn't read Steinbeck since high school. But the chair of the department, who was a woman, asked me to do it. So I was suddenly a director of the Steinbeck Center at San Jose State in 1987. So I took it on wholeheartedly. The provost said that if I didn't do something dramatic with the center, she would close it. And so I felt this mission to keep the center open. So I sponsored a 50th anniversary of the Grapes of Wrath, a conference that attracted like 300 people, and started a newsletter and started editing and started publishing all the things you have to do in academia to keep your job. And so I ran the center for 18 years. So really, I was thrust into the world of Steinbeck. But recently, I'd moved to California. And so really, Steinbeck brought me to California and made to love the state. So he also gave me a home. So it was a wonderful journey. What was Carol's educational background? Carol was born in San Jose, and she went to high school in San Jose. And then she didn't go to college. She went to secretarial school. And I don't think she really wanted to go to college, but she also said her sister was given, money to go to college. And she was always a little resentful of that. But I don't think she really wanted to go anyway. She wanted to see the big city. She went to San Francisco. She became a secretary, and she, worked in journalism, worked for Schilling Spice for a while. So I think she did exactly what she wanted, even though later on she complained that she hadn't gotten to go to university. She and her mother fought all the time. So she needed to get out of the house, actually. So that was her educational. But she read all the time. She loved Willa Cather. She probably brought Steinbeck to Willa Cather, which would have been a tremendous influence on his prose. The clarity of Willa Cather's voice and the subject matter, the West, writing about the West. I mean, Steinbeck was already determined to write about his home turf, but I think Carol really focused that attention. Was Carol a termite? No, she wasn't, because she never never got tested. Is the Steinbeck Center still at San Jose State? Yes, it's on the 5th floor of the library, right next to the Beethoven Center, and all that publicity about Beethoven's hair, that was my equivalent at San Jose State. So he bought all the 5 copies of strands of Beethoven's hair and had it tested. And so all that recent publicity about Beethoven, there's a Beethoven Center and a Steinbeck Center right next door. So I'm a little jealous that I didn't have Steinbeck's hair to, do DNA on and so and see what's what. So yes, it's still there, very active, largest collection of Steinbeck criticism, and they have manuscripts, etc. There was just a Steinbeck conference last week, actually. Did Carol do any writing of her own? She did. She wrote a little gardening seed. It was called a seed book. I'm not sure what that is, but she wrote a gardening book of some kind. And she did these wonderful cartoons of pink nude sportswomen. And Charlie Chaplin, who actually met Steinbeck as Steinbeck was writing The Grapes of Wrath, loved her little drawings, her little fanciful drawings. They were oversized women doing various sports. He loved them so much that he wanted to publish a book of them. That never happened, but he wanted to support her in her publication. So she did have some aspirations, but she never, later on, she became more focused on art. She did sculptures and was a member of the Carmel Art Association, but not so much writing, although she did write poetry. So she has some kind of poems modeled on, they were the New Yorker, Dorothy Parker was her model. And so she wrote a book of, she did write a book of poems, but it was privately published. And so it was never, she never tried to publish it. She just gave it to John as a Christmas present. Carol Steinbeck is buried in Salinas. Where is Ricketts buried? In the Monterey Cemetery. He's buried. His memorial service was out by the lighthouse on Point Pinos, but he was buried in the Monterey Cemetery. Thank you for sharing with us. Oh, good. I answered all the questions. I think. So I don't. Anybody else have a question? Thank you.